By the end of this class, my hope is that you'll be able to write competencies that are valuable, targeted at the appropriate level of mastery, reasonable to achieve, measurable, right-sized, and effective at telling the story of the holder's capabilities. To help us get from point A to point B, I plan on giving you some tools and techniques to not only build competencies, but also to test them out to see if they're really as great as you think they are. Before getting into what competencies are, let's look at what they are not. There are lots of ideas on the web that help guide educators and the development of classes and resources. The concepts are close enough to cause some confusion, so we're going to try to clear those up right now. Let's look at a few concepts from the education world that are often confused with competencies. One of those is the concept of learning activities. A learning activity is, as the name suggests, some kind of activity that is used to help someone learn. The most popular form of learning activity is a class or lecture. But learning activities can go much farther than a teacher and a classroom. Activities that help you learn could be reading a book, attending a conference, doing a side project, working closely with someone with more experience or skill, or simply working a job where new skills are learned by doing. The video you are watching right now is even a learning activity. Learning activities hope to influence behavior or increase knowledge, but there is no guarantee that it will happen. Often, learning activities are treated as the objective of education or training, but learning activities are only a means to an end. They are only the delivery mechanism, not the precious cargo. Don't get me wrong, I believe learning activities are important, but they are only useful in a balanced approach to education. Some examples of learning activities might include showing a video, giving a lecture, or breaking up into groups to work on a project. As you can imagine, there are many more types of learning activities. Thank goodness there are so many ways to learn, because people don't all learn the same way. Another concept that is often confused with competencies is that of learning objectives. Learning objectives are what a teacher or trainer uses to state what they hope to do during a learning activity like a class or hands-on project. Learning objectives are focused on what the teacher or teaching method will do to attempt to create learning. Learning objectives also help to establish the purpose of a learning activity and are usually stated in the future tense since they are used as a planning tool that looks forward into the future of the learning activity. Some learning activities might sound like students will hear about how to use Vuex and Vue.js-based front-end applications, or students will participate in a debate over the best front-end frameworks to use. Or students will complete a project where a front-end application is built in Vue.js and Vuex. The most commonly confused concept is the learning outcome. Learning outcomes are often confused with both learning objectives and competencies. It's understandable because of the similarities, but there are some subtle and important differences which justify their distinct utility. While learning objectives talk about what the teacher or learning activity will do, learning outcomes talk about what we hope the learner will do as a result of the learning activity. The desired result might be a new skill, some new knowledge, or a new attitude. Like learning objectives, learning outcomes are often set in the future tense because they refer to goals that look forward to a presumed future learning activity. Unlike learning objectives, learning outcomes are expected to be measured. We measure learning outcomes to know whether or not the learning activity was successful. Some examples of learning outcomes might include things like student will be able to integrate Vuex in a new and existing Vue.js front-end application. Or student will be able to build functional user input-driven front-end applications using Vuex and Vue.js. Or student will be able to defend the need for state management in front-end applications. Did you notice each of these learning outcomes starts with the same preamble? Student will be able to. This preamble is often called SWBAT or SWBAT. It's one of the most common ways to start phrasing a learning outcome statement. Now, let's shift our thinking to competencies by comparing them to the concepts by which they are often confused. Competencies differ from learning activities because they work on polar opposite sides of the student. Learning activities are things like classes, debates, projects, worksheets, videos, etc. Learning activities deliver information and try to influence behavior. They hopefully add something to the learner. However, competencies do none of those things. Competencies don't deliver information, except in telling others what the competency holder might do. Competencies don't add anything new to the learner, but only confirm and reveal what the learner can already do. Competencies aren't activities, but only statements of truth to which someone can aspire. Competencies differ from learning objectives because they are meant for two completely different audiences and purposes. Learning objectives help to document how an educator will use a learning activity. Learning objectives focus on what the teacher will do. On the other hand, competencies document abilities and skills while focusing on what the student can do. Competencies are very similar to learning outcomes in that they both communicate some capability or skill. Their difference lies in how they are used and to what they are tethered. Learning outcomes are closely tied to learning objectives and activities. The three often are used together in concert to help educators design well thought out learning plans. Learning outcomes actually contain competencies, but add extra expectations about the learning context or method. Take this learning outcome, for example. This learning outcome has two distinct sections: the learning context. After the live coding demonstration, the learner will, and it has the competency: build functional user input driven front-end applications using Vuex and Vue.s. You see, competencies differ from learning outcomes in that they don't focus at all on how the competencies were obtained. Competencies are simple statements of some capability, habit, or attitude. When, how, or why a person came to possess the capabilities is not important in competencies. What's important is that the person can demonstrate consistently that they have indeed mastered them. I will argue that learning outcomes cannot exist without competencies. But, on the other hand, competencies can most definitely stand on their own and bring value apart from the learning context. They are not the same thing, but one can certainly enable the other. As you saw earlier with learning outcomes, the preamble SWEBOT is a common helper. But when we think about competencies, SWEBOT puts us in slightly the wrong frame of mind. SWEBOT is thinking into the future about what the student will be able to do after the learning activity. For competencies, however, we want to think in the present tense. Competencies should state what a master is able to do right now. To help us with this, I recommend using another preamble, but only as a silent implied helper. Instead of thinking about what the student can do, think about what a master can do. What is that master able to do right now with their current skill set? Start your competency with master is able to, and then finish the statement. Let's take a look at this in action. With SWEBOT, we have student will be able to repair a 1cc gasoline-powered engine. Removing SWEBOT and using an implied MEAT, we have master is able to repair a 1cc gasoline-powered engine. On the left, we're talking about our hopes and dreams as an educator. On the right, we're talking about a proven capability of a skilled mechanic. On the left, we're talking about something that has not yet happened. And on the right, we're referring to something that has already been proven and continues to be true. With traditional SWEBOT, we have student will be able to construct a medical-grade PVC face mask for use in surgeries. Removing SWEBOT, we have simply master is able to construct a medical-grade PVC face mask for use in surgeries. On the left, again, our hopes and dreams as educators. On the right, we're talking about a proven capability. On the left, again, something that has not yet happened. And on the right, we're referring to something that has already been proven and continues to be true. By using MIAT instead of SWIBOT to help us frame competencies, we get our minds in the right place and we will write better competencies as a result. In many cases, as you can see, learning outcomes can be easily converted to competencies by simply removing the preamble that mentions the student or their learning context. For example, student will be able to integrate Vuex into new and existing Vue.js front-end applications. In this case, we can convert this to a competency simply by removing the preamble and considering MIAT as an implied preamble. Simply integrate Vue.js into new and existing Vue.js front-end applications. Here's another example. After the live coding demonstration, the learner will build functional user input driven front-end applications using Vuex and Vue.js. Here, we need to strip off the learning context, since competencies are not concerned with how the person gained the competency. The learning context here is the live coding demonstration. Take that away, and we have build functional user input driven front-end applications using Vuex and Vue.js. Remember, what matters is that they can do it, not how they learned it. Before we go any further, we need to address your motives for being here. Why should you care about competencies? Why should you spend your time and energy making your competencies strong? Why should you care about competencies? Well, I would argue because competencies work even when training doesn't. A popular complaint with training and certification is that it's not sufficient proof that on completion, the student can really perform as he or she was taught. We might use the training as an excuse to assign a complex task to an employee, but we won't really know if they can perform it until we see them in action. If they can't perform, we might repeat the training, try some other methods, or pair them with some more experienced person to help them learn. In the end, no matter how many teaching methods you employ, the one constant is the underlying competency, or the ability that enables the person to complete the complex task. If your training materials got wiped out somehow, your competencies could help rebuild those materials. If you find that a teaching method is no longer effective or relevant, you can use your competencies to build new teaching methods. If you have no training materials, classes, or learning activities of any sort, but you have competencies, at least people would know the target and what's expected of them, and very well might be able to rise to the occasion with only that knowledge to guide them. You see, competencies are immensely important because they are agnostic to and unaffected by the learning methods that attempt to teach them, and will be here long, long after those learning methods fade away and become irrelevant. Why should you care about competencies? Because competencies guide planning, teaching, and assessment. When planning anything, it's always good to have a target or a set of goals to guide us. This approach works in training and education just like it works in finance and construction. When you plan training with the end goal in sight, then all your planning moves in the direction of that goal. A well-developed set of strong competencies can serve as this goal when you're planning out your training, your courses, your learning activities. Those same competencies can also be used to focus assessments on the most important pieces. In many cases, competencies themselves can serve as assessments. Why should you care about competencies? Because competencies demonstrate preparedness and trustworthiness. When a hiring manager or supervisor is looking for someone to complete a task, they need a high degree of confidence that the candidate can perform the task and achieve success. In some situations, a supervisor already has experience with the employee, so their ability to perform the task is already obvious. In other situations where employees are less familiar, how can a supervisor make the best decision? Well-written, strong competencies can help supervisors and hiring managers know who they are working with and make better decisions for placements. Why should you care about competencies? Because competencies contribute to careers. When you walk into a professional's office or look at someone's LinkedIn profile, you will certainly notice the accolades they have received, certifications they've earned, and schools they've graduated from. On the person's resume, you'll notice the companies they've worked for that have formed the person's professional experience. All this paints the picture of who the person is professionally and where their career has come from. Well-written, strong competencies can play an important part in providing more detail to that picture by describing a person's actual capabilities instead of just events in history. When we start with well-written competencies, we set the stage for any other activities, objectives, or outcomes to ensure that those things are laser guided to reach their targets effectively and efficiently. We also leave our learners and their future supervisors with a visible trail of their proven capabilities. Why should you care about competencies? Because education is not about what we can teach, but what our students can learn and turn into active success.